The word hit Dorothy Bancroft like a fist to the sternum. Liar. She heard it from across the dusty main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the bruising August heat of 1882, spoken by a voice she had loved more than she had ever loved breathing. Her daughter, Clara, 14 years old and tall as a reed, stood on the warped boardwalk outside the marshal's office with her dark eyes blazing and her jaw set like iron, and she said it again. "You are a liar, Mama. You promised you would come home for my birthday. You promised, and you did not come." Dorothy stood in the street with her badge catching the afternoon glare, her hat pushed back from a face that had not slept in 36 hours, and she felt the word carve a groove straight through her chest. She had ridden through 2 nights without stopping, outpaced a cold-blooded gang of cattle thieves across 40 miles of open prairie, watched a man she barely knew take a bullet meant for her, and dragged herself back to Caldwell with her knuckles split and her conscience raw. She had done all of that because it was her duty, because people were counting on her, because that was the bargain she had made with this badge and this town and this life. And she had missed Clara's birthday by exactly 1 day. Behind Clara, leaning in the door frame of the marshal's office with his arms folded and his expression carefully neutral, stood John Underwood, Deputy Marshal, 6 feet of quiet competence with dark hair going silver at the temples and brown eyes that had seen far too much to be easily shocked. He was watching Dorothy and Clara with the measured attention of a man who knew he had no right to intervene and was fighting himself hard on the subject. "Clara," Dorothy said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect it to be. "Come inside. Let me explain." "You always explain," Clara said. The word always fell between them like a stone dropped into still water. "You always have a reason. There is always something more important than me." Dorothy crossed the street. She did not run, because running felt like panic, and she could not afford panic in front of her daughter or her deputy or this town that watched everything with the hungry curiosity of people who had little else to entertain them. She crossed the street and she took Clara's face in both hands, dusty gloves and all, and she said very quietly, "There is nothing more important than you, not one single thing on this earth." Clara's chin trembled. Then her eyes filled and she pulled away and she went inside. Dorothy stood on the boardwalk and breathed. John Underwood straightened out of the door frame and looked at her, and she could not read his expression, which was unusual because she had spent 18 months reading that man's face like a trail map. "She stayed up all day waiting," he said, "just that, just the facts, delivered with the same quiet precision he applied to everything." "I know," Dorothy said. "She baked a cake herself, with Mrs. Alderman's help." Dorothy closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them and walked inside. The story of how Dorothy Bancroft came to be a marshal in Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1882, was not the kind of story people told their children at bedtime, because it did not begin with adventure or ambition. It began with grief. Her husband, Thomas Bancroft, had been the Marshal of Caldwell for 6 years before a bootlegger named Preston Hale put a bullet through him on a Tuesday evening in April of 1879. Thomas had been a good man, a careful man, a man who came home every night smelling of horse and leather, and always remembered to leave his boots at the door because Clara, who had been 11 then, was always running barefoot across the floor. He had been the kind of man who kept his promises. He had also been the kind of man who underestimated the violence that lived quietly inside men who felt they had nothing to lose. Dorothy had stood over his coffin in the April cold and felt the entire architecture of her life collapse. She had a daughter to raise. She had a house with a mortgage that Thomas's salary had only barely been meeting. She had no family within 500 miles and no skills beyond running a household and keeping books, which she had done for the mercantile store on the corner of Main, and second for 3 years before Clara was born. The town council had gathered within the week to discuss who would replace Thomas. They were decent men on the whole, practical men, and they had offered Dorothy a modest widow's pension that would have covered perhaps half of what she needed to survive. She had listened to their offer in the stuffy back room of the council hall, and then she had said something that made 3 of the 5 men choke on their coffee. "I want the job," she said. "I want to be the marshal." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the clock on the wall ticking. "Mrs. Bancroft," said Mayor Elias Prout, a round man with impressive side whiskers and a permanent expression of mild anxiety, "that is simply not done." "A great many things that are not done," Dorothy said, "turn out upon examination to be perfectly possible. I know this town. Thomas told me everything. I know the people who cause trouble and the people who prevent it. I know where the cattle thieves water their horses, and I know which saloons sell watered-down whiskey and which ones sell the real thing. I know how to shoot because Thomas taught me, and I need an income that will keep my daughter fed and housed and educated." She paused. "You need someone who will take this job seriously rather than treating it as a stepping stone to county politics. I am offering you both things at once." Mayor Prout had looked at her for a long moment, and then he had looked at the other council members, and then he had looked back at her. "You understand," he said carefully, "that this arrangement would be extraordinary, that people would talk." "People talk about everything," Dorothy said. "It has never once stopped the sun from rising." They gave her the job. It was not a unanimous vote, and it was not a warm one, but they gave it to her, and she had worn that badge for 3 years without giving them a single reason to regret the decision. She was fair, and she was thorough, and she was, as she had promised, serious about every aspect of the work. She also went home every evening she possibly could, helped Clara with her schoolwork, and made a point of being present for every birthday, every school recital, every ordinary Tuesday that her daughter needed her. Until this one. The reason she had missed Clara's 14th birthday had a name: the Paget brothers. There were 4 of them, and they had been moving cattle across the county line in a systematic way that had cost 3 local ranchers significant income over the course of the summer. Dorothy had been building a case against them for 2 months, gathering testimony, tracking movement, working with the county sheriff in a careful triangulation of evidence. And then, on the morning of Clara's birthday, she had received word that the Paget brothers had moved. They were leaving the county. If she did not ride that day, they would be gone, and 2 months of work would evaporate like morning dew on a hot rock. She had ridden. She had caught them. She had also, in the process, ridden directly into a trap they had set in the event that anyone followed, which told her they had known she was coming, which meant someone in Caldwell had been feeding them information, which was a whole separate problem she now needed to deal with on top of everything else. The man who had taken the bullet meant for her was a rancher named Silas Combs, who had nothing to do with any of it, but happened to be riding in the same direction, and had seen the ambush a half-second before Dorothy did. He had pushed her horse out of the line of fire and caught the shot in his shoulder for his trouble. The bullet had not been fatal, and she had gotten him to a doctor in the next town before she came home, but the guilt of it sat in her chest like a stone she could not put down. She had come home expecting her daughter to be angry. She had come home expecting to have to explain herself and apologize and do the painful, necessary work of repair. What she had not quite expected, though she supposed she should have, was to find John Underwood in the middle of it. John Underwood had come to Caldwell 8 months ago, in the December of 1881, on the recommendation of the county sheriff, who had described him as the best deputy he had ever had and could no longer afford to pay since the county's budget had been cut. Dorothy had interviewed him in her office on a cold afternoon with snow dusting the windows, and she had formed several impressions in rapid succession. He was competent. He was self-contained to the point of mystery. He had brown eyes that held a quality she could only describe as watchful sadness, the look of a man who had lost something significant and was still in the process of deciding what to do about that. He was 34 years old, had worked in law enforcement in 3 different territories, and came with a file of commendations that was frankly embarrassing in its length. He had also, within his first week in Caldwell, made Clara laugh for the first time in what felt like months. It had happened at the office. Clara had come by after school with a question about something she was reading, some passage in a history book about the settlement of Kansas, and John had been there alone because Dorothy was out on a call. Clara had been hesitant, because she was always a little hesitant with strangers, and then John had answered her question with such patient thoroughness, treating her with the same seriousness he brought to every other aspect of his work, that Clara had asked a second question, and then a third, and by the time Dorothy returned they had been deep in a conversation about the political situation in the territory that had Dorothy pausing in the doorway with a strange and complicated feeling moving through her. She had been grateful. She had also been very careful about what she did with that gratitude, because she was a widow with a daughter and a badge in a small town, and she had approximately no margin for error in her personal life. But John Underwood was difficult to ignore. He did his work with a quiet diligence that made Dorothy's job easier in ways she had not anticipated. He noticed things. He anticipated problems before they materialized. He had a way of reading a room that she had only seen in experienced investigators, the ability to walk into a space and immediately understand the emotional topography of everyone in it. He was also, she discovered gradually, deeply fair in a world that often required active effort to be so. He treated the Mexican vaqueros and the Negro cowboys who came through Caldwell with the same professional respect he extended to white ranchers and businessmen, which was not common, and which she noticed because she tried to do the same thing and knew how much quiet resistance it generated. Over 8 months, they had developed a working partnership that functioned with a precision that sometimes surprised both of them. They had also, in the interstitial moments of that partnership, the coffee shared at the beginning of long days and the quiet evenings when the office was empty and the town had settled, and there was nothing urgent demanding either of them, begun to know each other in ways that were not strictly professional. Dorothy knew that his full name was John Henry Underwood, that he had grown up in Missouri and moved west at 22, that he had been married once briefly to a woman named Alice who had died of fever 6 years ago before they had children, that he drank his coffee black and preferred not to talk in the mornings until his second cup, that he read everything he could get his hands on, with a particular fondness for history and natural science, that he had a dry, understated sense of humor that ambushed her regularly, slipping past her defenses in moments when she was least prepared for it. She also knew, though she had never put the knowledge into words even to herself, that his presence in her life had changed the texture of it in ways she could not entirely account for and did not entirely want to examine too closely. Inside the Marshal's office, Clara had taken herself to the small back room that served as a combination records room and storage space and closed the door. Dorothy could hear her moving around in there, the specific sound of a teenager's controlled grief, things picked up and set down with slightly too much force. Dorothy sat at her desk and pressed her hands flat on the surface and breathed. "She was not angry with you until about 4 in the afternoon," John said. He had come back inside and was standing by the window, looking out at the street with the particular alertness he always maintained, the habit of a man who never quite stopped watching for trouble. Before that she was mostly worried. "Which is worse?" Dorothy said. "Yes," he agreed, "much worse." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. That was one of the things about John Underwood. The silences with him were rarely uncomfortable. He had a capacity for quiet that Dorothy had come to value enormously because her life was loud in ways that had nothing to do with sound. "There is something else," she said. He turned from the window. "Someone told the Pagets I was coming," she said. "They had set a trap. It was specific. It was placed at the exact point on the trail where I would have been riding, and it was set the night before I arrived, which means someone in Caldwell sent word." She paused. "Someone I trust, or someone with access to this office." John was very still. How many people knew you were riding out that morning? 5, she said. You, Mayor Prout, Sheriff Danforth, Mrs. Alderman, and Clara. You are not seriously considering Clara. No, Dorothy said. But that is 4 people, one of whom is the mayor of this town. John moved from the window to the chair across her desk and sat down. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, and she recognized the posture as his thinking posture. Danforth has been pushing to take over the Paget case for a month, he said. If they got away, the investigation would naturally move to his jurisdiction. That is the most logical conclusion, Dorothy agreed. But I need to be absolutely certain before I accuse a county sheriff of conspiring with cattle thieves. Agreed, he said. And in the meantime, you should sleep because you look like you have been dragged behind a horse. Thank you, she said dryly. That is exactly what a woman hopes to hear. Something shifted in his expression, something that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. You look like what you are, he said. A person who has been riding for 2 days and doing hard and dangerous work. That is not an insult. She looked at him for a moment too long, then she looked away. I need to go talk to my daughter, she said. Yes, he said. You do. She went to the back room and knocked. There was a long pause, and then Clara said, Come in the flat voice of a teenager who has resigned herself to having a conversation she does not want to have. Dorothy opened the door. Clara was sitting on the cot they kept in the back for emergencies, her knees drawn up and her arms around them, and she looked so much like Thomas in that moment that Dorothy felt the old grief move through her like a cold current of river water. I am sorry, Dorothy said. She sat down on the cot beside Clara, not touching her, just close. I am deeply sorry that I missed your birthday. You deserved to have your mother home and you did not, and that is the truth of it. You always have reasons, Clara said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. The anger, Dorothy knew, was easier to carry than the hurt that lived underneath it. I know, Dorothy said, and most of them are good reasons, and that does not make any of it fair to you. She paused. There was a man hurt because he helped me yesterday. He was not part of anything, he just happened to be there and he helped me. His name is Silas Combs, and he has a wife and 3 children in the next county, and he is going to have a hard few months while his shoulder heals. She paused again. I think about people like him. I think about what would happen to this town and the people in it if there was no one doing this work seriously. But I also think about you all the time, even when I am not here. Clara was quiet. I promised you I would be home for your birthday, Dorothy said, and I was not. I broke that promise and I cannot undo it. She turned to look at her daughter's profile. I do not break my promises lightly, I never have, but I broke this one and I am sorry. Clara uncurled slowly. She leaned sideways and rested her head on Dorothy's shoulder, and Dorothy put her arm around her and held her, and the complicated architecture of their love, built from grief and necessity, and the particular closeness of 2 people who only had each other, settled around them both like something that had been waiting to be put back in place. Mr. Underwood stayed with me, Clara said. He did not have to. He stayed and he helped me with the cake and he read to me from the newspaper after supper. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. That was kind of him, she said carefully. He talks about you, Clara said. There was a particular quality to the observation, the neutral delivery of a teenager who is testing a reaction. We work together, Dorothy said. People who work together talk about each other. He talks about you the way Papa used to talk about you, Clara said. Dorothy said nothing. The silence lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. Mama, Clara said, it has been 3 years. I know, sweetheart, Dorothy said softly. Papa would not want you to be lonely. Dorothy pulled her daughter closer and rested her cheek on the top of Clara's head. Let us talk about something else, she said. Tell me about the cake. The investigation into who had betrayed her movements to the Paget brothers took 3 weeks, and an amount of patience that Dorothy had to rebuild from scratch every morning. She and John worked it with the careful, methodical thoroughness that characterized everything they did together, documenting every possible avenue of information, cross-referencing timelines, having quiet and very private conversations with people they trusted. The answer, when it came, was not Sheriff Danforth. It was Elias Prout. The mayor. The shape of it, once Dorothy and John had laid all the pieces out together on the desk on a quiet Thursday evening, was almost elegant in its ugliness. Prude had been taking a percentage from the Paget brothers for 8 months, a quiet tax on their stolen cattle operation that he justified, Dorothy imagined, as a kind of informal business arrangement. When Dorothy had gotten too close, he had passed word through an intermediary, a clerk in his office named Fenton, who had not known he was passing information to criminals, only that the mayor had asked him to send a message to a man who turned out to be connected to the Paget network. "He did not mean to have you killed," John said, examining the letter they had finally obtained through a contact in Prude's former county of residence. "He meant to have you embarrassed." The ambush was the Paget's decision, not his. "That distinction," Dorothy said, "will provide him very little comfort at his trial." "No," John agreed. "It will not." They arrested Elias Prude on a Friday morning. Dorothy did it herself in his office with John at her back and 2 witnesses from the town council present. Prude had gone white as new linen and then deeply, emphatically red, and had said a number of things that Dorothy let pass without response, because she had learned long ago that the most effective response to a man's outrage about being held accountable was a steady, unimpressed silence. He was taken to the county seat for trial. Fenton, the clerk, cooperated fully and was not charged. The Paget brothers, 2 of whom were already in custody from Dorothy's ride, were subsequently located and arrested by a different set of lawmen who were not on anyone's payroll. The town council met in emergency session and appointed a temporary mayor. They also, Dorothy noted, sent her a formal letter of thanks that was so thoroughly written by a lawyer that it contained no actual human warmth whatsoever. But she kept it because she kept everything official, filed it in the appropriate place, and moved on. What she did not move on from quite so easily was the conversation she had with John the evening after Prude's arrest, when the office was quiet and the town had absorbed the shock of the day and settled into the peculiar calm that follows a significant disruption. "You handled that exactly right," he said. He was cleaning his revolver at the other desk, the methodical, practiced movement of someone who has done it so many times it requires no conscious thought. Every step of it. "I handled it the only way I know how," she said. She was writing the formal report for the county, the kind of document that needed to be precise and complete and utterly without emotional inflection. "Carefully, methodically, without making accusations until I had evidence. That is what right looks like," he said. "In my experience." She looked up from the report. He was focused on what he was doing, not looking at her, which somehow made the observation feel more genuine rather than less. She had noticed that about him from the beginning. He did not deliver compliments as performance. He said things when he meant them and was quiet when he did not. "John," she said. He looked up. She had not entirely planned what she said next, which was unusual for her. "Why did you stay with Clara on her birthday?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because she was alone," he said. "You could have left her with Mrs. Alderman." "Mrs. Alderman had gone home by 4 o'clock, he said. "Clara was in the office waiting, and I was not going to leave a 14-year-old girl alone in the evening because her mother was out doing necessary work." He paused. "It was not complicated. She said you read to her from the newspaper. She wanted to know about the territorial elections," he said. "She has opinions about them." "She does," Dorothy agreed. Clara had, in fact, been expressing opinions about Kansas politics since she was 11, which Dorothy had always privately believed was Thomas's doing, a legacy of all those dinner-table conversations. "She is remarkable," John said. "You have done something remarkable with her." The directness of it startled her. She set down her pen. "Her father helped," she said, "before he was gone." "I know," he said. "But you have been the one here for 3 years doing this job and raising that child, and she is thoughtful and curious and fundamentally decent. That does not happen by accident." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. The lantern light was warm on the planes of his face, and the silver at his temples caught it, and she was aware of something she had been aware of for a while now, something she had been very carefully not naming. "I should finish this report," she said. "Yes," he said. He looked back down at the revolver. Neither of them moved for a moment that was approximately 3 seconds longer than it needed to be. Then Dorothy picked up her pen and John resumed cleaning the revolver, and the evening continued in its quiet and carefully maintained way, and nothing was said, and everything was understood. September arrived with a cooler edge, the hard blue sky of Kansas autumn sharpening over the town like a knife being honed. The grasslands turned gold, and the cottonwoods along the creek went yellow, and Caldwell settled into the industrious quietude of a cattle town between seasons. The summer trail drives had ended. The cowboys who had flooded the saloons and the hotels, and occasionally the jail through the hot months, had gone back south or taken on ranch work for the winter. The town was quieter, more itself. Dorothy breathed it in and felt, for the first time in a long while, something that might cautiously be described as peace. She had, in the weeks following the Prude affair, made several deliberate changes to her routines. One of them was walking home for supper instead of eating at her desk when she could manage it. Another was attending Clara's school functions without scheduling conflicts, a thing she had done imperfectly before and now did with iron determination. A third, and this was perhaps the most significant, was allowing herself to speak to John Underwood as a person rather than only as a colleague. It was a subtle shift, the kind that could be walked back if necessary, and she told herself that was why she permitted it. But the truth, which she was beginning to approach from several directions simultaneously, was simpler and more straightforward. She was lonely, and his company relieved it. He had begun walking with her sometimes in the mornings, before the office opened, along the creek where the cottonwoods grew, and the light came sideways through the leaves and made everything look like something worth seeing. It had started because they both rose early and both walked the perimeter of the town as a matter of habit, and it was natural enough that their habits should intersect. But natural enough was not the same as accidental, and they both knew it. On one of those mornings in late September, when the creek was running low and the air had the sweet, sharp smell of autumn cottonwood leaves, he said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to tell me if I am overstepping." She kept walking. "Tell me," she said. "I have been trying to decide whether what I feel for you is appropriate to acknowledge," he said. He spoke with the careful precision of a man who has rehearsed the structure of a sentence but is choosing the specific words as he goes. "I am aware of the ways in which our situation is complicated, the professional relationship, the town, your daughter," he paused, "your husband. Thomas has been gone 3 years, she said. Her voice was level. "I know," he said, "and I am not asking you to stop grieving him. I am not sure that grief has a schedule. I am saying that I think about you in ways that go beyond our work, and I would rather you knew that than not knew it, because I believe in honesty above most things, and this particular silence has started to feel dishonest." Dorothy stopped walking. He stopped a step later and turned to face her. The creek murmured behind him and the leaves moved in the early breeze, and he looked at her with those watchful brown eyes that held nothing back when he let them, and she felt, very clearly and without any ambivalence at all, that she had been waiting for this moment for some time. "I think about you as well," she said, "in ways that go beyond our work." He said nothing. He was, she had learned, the kind of man who let important things have space. "I am also not sure what to do with that," she said. "I am the Marshal of this town. I have a 14-year-old daughter who has already lost one parent and who, whether she would admit it, is watching me carefully to see what comes next. I cannot afford to be careless." "I would never ask you to be careless," he said. "I know," she said. "That is one of the things that makes this particularly difficult." He studied her face in the morning light. "What would careful look like?" he asked. It was such a precisely practical question, so entirely characteristic of him, that she almost smiled. "It would look like what we are already doing," she said. "Knowing each other, taking the time to know each other properly." She paused. "And perhaps occasionally acknowledging that the time is being taken with intention." "I can do that," he said. "Good," she said. They walked back to town together in the early light, and nothing had changed outwardly, and everything had shifted beneath the surface like tectonic plates, slow and enormous and irreversible. Clara noticed. She noticed in the way that sharp, observant teenagers notice things, quietly and completely, and then deploy their knowledge with a timing that is either very good or very terrible depending on how charitable you are feeling about adolescent social awareness. She noticed on a Sunday afternoon in October, when John had come to supper at their house for the first time, an invitation Dorothy had extended in a carefully casual manner that had not fooled Clara for a second. John had brought a jar of honey from a vendor at the Mercantile and a recent newspaper from Wichita, which he had left in Clara's chair, and Clara had looked at him with an expression that Dorothy could only describe as appraising, the look of someone taking a very thorough measurement. They had eaten roast chicken and fresh bread and apple preserves, and John had talked to Clara about the elections and the territorial situation and a book she was reading for school, and he had asked questions and listened to the answers with what Dorothy recognized as his genuine attention rather than his polite attention, which were two entirely different things. After supper, while Dorothy was washing the dishes and John was helping Clara with a problem in her arithmetic that had been troubling her for days, Dorothy stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the last light on the street and felt something very large and very quiet settle in her chest. Later, when John had gone and Clara was getting ready for bed, Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown and looked at her mother with those dark eyes that were so much like Thomas's. "He is a good man," Clara said. "Yes," Dorothy said, "he is." "He looks at you," Clara said, "when he thinks you are not watching." Dorothy kept her expression neutral. "Go to bed, sweetheart." "I am just saying," Clara said. "Good night, Clara." Clara went to bed, and Dorothy stood in the kitchen with the dish towel in her hands and felt the complicated, terrifying, entirely wonderful weight of what was happening to her, and for the first time in 3 years, allowed herself to simply feel it without immediately cataloging the ways it could go wrong. The winter came to Caldwell in stages. First the cold that cleared the air to a transparency that made distances deceptive. Then the hard frosts that turned the creek to glass each morning. Then a snowfall in December that blanketed the town in a quiet so profound it felt almost sacred. Dorothy had always loved Kansas winter. Thomas had teased her about it, called her the only woman in the territory who actively looked forward to January, and she had told him it was because the snow made everything honest, stripped away the verdant optimism of summer, and showed the bones of the land. The winter also brought a change in her relationship with John Underwood, incremental and deliberate, and accompanied at every stage by the particular carefulness she had said she needed and he had said he respected. They walked together most mornings now, and did not pretend it was accidental. They had supper at her house twice a week with Clara, which had become routine enough that Clara set his place without being asked, and John brought something each time, coffee or preserves or a piece of news from the wider world. They talked, really talked about everything, their work and their histories and their opinions and their memories. She told him about Thomas, not as a memorial or an obstacle, but as the truth of her life, the man who had made her who she was before he was gone. He told her about Alice, about the 18 months of their marriage before the fever took her, about the particular devastation of losing someone before you had fully become used to the idea that they were yours. "Does it diminish eventually?" She asked him one evening, not about Alice specifically, but about the shape of loss in general. "It changes," he said. "It does not diminish exactly. It becomes something you carry differently. You get stronger around it." He paused. "Or the shape of it changes to fit more comfortably inside you, and you cannot always tell which is which." She thought about that for a long time. "Thomas kept his promises," she said, unexpectedly, not sure where it came from. "He was meticulous about it. He thought that a promise was essentially a piece of your character, that every time you made one and kept it, you were building something, and every time you broke one, you were dismantling it. "You are the same way," John said. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because I have watched you for a year," he said simply. "I have watched you keep promises to this town and to Clara and to the people who depend on you. And I have watched you, when you cannot keep one, hold yourself to account for it in a way that is sometimes harder on you than it needs to be." "Clara's birthday," she said. "Yes," he said, "among other things. I was not harder on myself than the situation warranted," she said, a slight edge of defensiveness in her voice. "You were," he said without any heat at all. "Clara forgave you within 48 hours. You have been carrying the weight of it for 3 months." She opened her mouth and then closed it because he was not wrong. He had a habit of being not wrong that she found both extremely valuable and occasionally irritating. "It is because I promised her," she said finally. "I told her I would be there and I was not." "You also told me once that the job sometimes required you to make choices between goods, and that there was no clean answer in those situations, only the most responsible choice available." He paused. "You applied that principle to Silas Combs's injury and found yourself blameless. You have not applied it to Clara's birthday." "Silas Combs is a grown man who made his own choice in that moment," Dorothy said. "Clara is my child." "Yes," he said. "And she has a mother who loves her thoroughly and shows up for her in every way she is capable of, and who, on one extraordinary occasion, had to choose between keeping a birthday promise and stopping 4 men from continuing to rob her neighbors blind." He looked at her steadily. "Clara understands this. She told me she does." Dorothy was quiet. "She told you that?" "She did," he said. "She also told me that she is proud of you, and that she wishes you were not always so hard on yourself, and that she thinks you are the best Marshal Caldwell has ever had." He paused. "Her exact words were that you were better than her father was, which she said she hopes you will not take as a criticism of her father, only as a measurement of what you have built." Dorothy looked away. She looked at the fire in the stove and the shadows it made on the wall, and she pressed her lips together very firmly and breathed through her nose. "She did not say all of that at once," John said, with a gentleness that was all the more effective for being understated. "It came out over several conversations over several months. She is working through things as well in her own way." "I know," Dorothy said. Her voice was rougher than usual. John reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was the first deliberate touch beyond ordinary necessity, the first thing that was unmistakably tender rather than collegial, and Dorothy felt it run straight up her arm and into her chest and radiate outward through her entire body like warmth from a fire. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat that way for a while, by the stove, in the quiet kitchen, while the December wind moved around the house and the fire crackled and the evening deepened into night. No promises were made and no declarations were offered, because neither of them was careless, and they both understood that this moment was a beginning, not a conclusion. But it was, unmistakably, a beginning. Christmas in Caldwell in 1882 was a modest affair by most standards, shaped by the realities of a cattle town in winter, but it had warmth in it that Dorothy had not expected. Mrs. Alderman organized a church social and decorated the hall with cedar boughs and candles. The mercantile put out oranges that had come up from the south on the last train, a luxury that made Clara's eyes go wide. A fiddle player from one of the ranches came into town, and there was dancing in the hotel dining room on Christmas Eve. John had asked Dorothy to dance. She had said yes. They had danced twice, which was the precise number of times a woman could dance with the same man in a small town before the observation became general, and then they had stood at the edge of the room and watched Clara dance with the schoolmaster's son, who was 17 and very earnest, and John had said something quiet and funny about the boy's footwork that made Dorothy laugh, actually laugh, the kind of laughter that comes from somewhere real. The town had noticed them. The town noticed everything, as Dorothy had pointed out to the mayor 3 years ago, and the noticing was mostly benign. Mrs. Alderman had taken to sending them both coffee at the same time when she delivered it to the office, as if they were a pair that needed to be fed together. The blacksmith had told John, apparently with complete seriousness, that the Marshal was the finest woman in Caldwell, and that any man who was not paying close attention was a fool. John had reported this to Dorothy with the neutral expression he used when he was amused and did not want to show it too obviously, and she had told him the blacksmith was a good man with excellent judgment. They were careful. They were honest with each other. They were, in the slow and deliberate way that two cautious people can manage it, falling genuinely and deeply in love. In January, John asked her to supper. Not at her house, not at the office, but at the hotel restaurant which served the closest thing to a formal meal that Caldwell had to offer. He arrived at her door and waited and walked with her through the cold, dark street and held the door of the restaurant for her. And she wore the blue dress that Thomas had bought her once and that she had not worn in 3 years. And she had not decided to wear it consciously, but when she put it on, she had thought it was time. They talked for 3 hours over a meal that neither of them paid very much attention to, because the conversation was better than the food and they were both ravenous for it in a way that had nothing to do with the beef stew on the table. They talked about their futures, carefully at first and then with increasing directness. They talked about what they wanted from their lives, about the shape of things they hoped for. "Clara will be grown before very long," Dorothy said. 4 years. "She will want to go to school somewhere, a real school, not just the one here. She is clever enough for it." "She is," John agreed. "What will you do when she goes?" "I have thought about it," Dorothy said. "I think I will still be Marshal, or perhaps not. Perhaps I will have done what I can do here and it will be time for something else." "What else?" he asked. He was watching her with that direct, uncomplicated attention that she had come to understand as one of the defining qualities of who he was. He looked at the things he valued. He did not look away from them. "I do not know entirely," she said. "I know that I do not want to be alone indefinitely." She met his eyes. "I know that with more certainty than I know anything else at the moment." "I do not want you to be alone indefinitely either," he said. His voice was quiet and entirely certain. "John," she said. "I am not saying this carelessly," he said. "I have spent a year being very careful, and I believe I understand what I am feeling, and I understand what I am hoping for, and I would like to be honest with you about it." He paused. "I love you. I am in love with you. I have been for some time, and I have been waiting until I was sure that I could say it without it being pressure, without it being something you felt you had to respond to in any particular way." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight of the hotel restaurant with the sound of other conversations around them and the smell of wood smoke and food and winter air coming under the door, and she felt something in her chest move into alignment like a key in a lock. "I love you as well," she said. "I have been waiting until I could say it without being frightened of it." "Are you still frightened of it?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "A little," she said, "but not enough to stay quiet." He reached across the table, and she gave him her hand, and they sat like that while the evening continued around them, and neither of them said another word for a full minute because there was nothing that needed to be said. She told Clara the next morning over breakfast, with the winter light coming flat and white through the kitchen window. She told her directly, as she told Clara everything that mattered, because her daughter deserved honesty and had always been capable of handling it. Clara listened without interrupting, which was unusual. Then she said, "What does that mean for us, for our family?" "I do not know yet exactly," Dorothy said. "We are being careful. Neither of us is in any hurry. Whatever happens will happen slowly and honestly." "But you love him," Clara said. "Yes," Dorothy said. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then very carefully she said, "Do you think he loves me too, not the way he loves you, but in a way that matters?" Dorothy looked at her daughter, at the vulnerability in that question, the thing Clara was really asking, which was whether she would be included or displaced, whether this love was additive or subtractive. "Yes," Dorothy said. "I believe he does, and I think you already know that because you are too perceptive not to have seen it." Clara was quiet again. Then she nodded, a single, decisive nod. "All right," she said. She picked up her spoon and continued eating her breakfast. "You should still be careful, though. On behalf of our dignity as a household. On behalf of our dignity, Dorothy repeated solemnly. Exactly, Clara said. Spring came to Caldwell with the particular aggression of a Kansas spring, sudden and loud and full of wind and wild color, and it brought with it a development that nobody had anticipated, a competing bid for Dorothy's job. His name was Vernon Stark, and he had recently arrived in Caldwell from Colorado, where he claimed to have served as a marshal for 2 years, and he had made his intention to stand as a candidate for the marshal's position very clear to whoever would listen. He had particular support from 2 of the newer council members who had been appointed in the chaos of the Prude affair, men who had not seen what Dorothy had built in this town, and who seemed to regard a woman in law enforcement as a novelty that ought by now to have run its course. Dorothy heard about it on a Tuesday and spent exactly 2 hours being angry about it, and then redirected the energy into a plan. He has a right to put himself forward, she told John, who was also angry but with better control of it. And the council has a right to consider candidates. What I need to do is make the case for why I should continue. Your record speaks for itself, John said. The Prude arrest alone would keep most marshals employed for a decade. My record speaks to people who are inclined to listen to it, she said. I need to speak to people who are inclined to discount it. She paused. Which means I need to be visible and direct in a way I do not usually prefer. She was. Over the next 3 weeks, Dorothy Bancroft made herself known throughout Caldwell in a manner that was not exactly a campaign, but was most of the component parts of one. She attended every town meeting. She visited the ranchers and the merchants and the saloon owners and the church people and the families who had been in Caldwell since before it was properly a town. She listened. She answered questions without defensiveness. She made a clear and specific case for her own continuation in the role she had built and the work she had done. She also, with absolute deliberateness, declined to make a single comment about Vernon Stark that was not factual, courteous, and professional, because she had learned long ago that the way you behaved under pressure was the most honest advertisement for the kind of person you actually were. The council voted on the last Thursday in April. Dorothy won, 6-1. The dissenting vote was cast by a man named Brewster who had been against the original appointment in 1879 and was, she had been told, constitutionally unable to change his mind about anything once it was formed. She walked back to the office in the warm spring afternoon, and John was standing outside waiting, and she could tell from his expression that someone had already told him the result. 6-1, she said. Good, he said with a simplicity that said everything. Brewster voted against. Of course he did, John said. I cannot decide whether the consistency is admirable or infuriating, she said. Both, he said. Probably. She stopped in front of him on the boardwalk and looked up at him in the afternoon light and felt the spring air moving around her and said, I have been thinking about something. Tell me, he said. I have been thinking, she said, that being careful does not require being indefinite, that there is a point at which carefulness becomes its own kind of fear. She paused. I do not want to be afraid of this, of you, of what we are. He was very still, watching her. I am not proposing anything rash, she said. I am saying that I love you and I would like for that to be a real thing in our lives. Not a private thing we hold carefully away from everything else, but a real and declared and present thing. I have been waiting, he said, for you to be ready, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted it to be your choice as much as mine. It is my choice, she said. I am making it now. He reached up and touched her face briefly, just the back of his fingers against her cheek in the bright spring afternoon, and she leaned into it for a half-second, and they were on the main street of Caldwell in full view of anyone who happened to be looking, and she found she did not care at all. Then I will make mine, he said. Clearly, formally. Dorothy Bancroft, will you do me the honor of allowing me to court you properly? With the full and public knowledge of this town and your daughter and anyone else who has opinions about the matter. Yes, she said, I will. He smiled then, a real smile, One of the ones she had been cataloging all year, the quiet ones that started in his eyes and traveled down, and she felt it in her chest like something arriving after a very long journey. The courtship of Dorothy Bancroft and John Underwood was, by the standards of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1883, entirely proper and only slightly unconventional. The unconventional part being that Dorothy was the Marshal and John was her deputy, and they shared a professional life alongside the personal one, which created a dynamic that the town had never quite seen before but eventually decided was entertaining rather than scandalous. They walked together openly. They attended church on Sundays and sat together, which Clara had engineered by sitting between them the first time and then, the following Sunday, deliberately sitting on Dorothy's other side, so that John was on the outside and Dorothy was in the middle, which meant that the next Sunday John sat on Dorothy's left and Clara sat on her right, and the arrangement resolved itself into something that looked a great deal like a family. Clara had, with the deliberate grace of a girl who has decided something is all right and is going to make it all right by force of will, adopted a warmly matter-of-fact attitude toward John that made Dorothy's heart contract with a particular tenderness. She did not call him anything except Mr. Underwood, which was appropriate, but she included him in the household with a naturalness that went beyond mere tolerance. She asked his opinion. She saved him interesting articles from newspapers. She argued with him, which Dorothy recognized as Clara's highest form of respect, since she only argued seriously with people whose minds she regarded as worth engaging. John, for his part, treated Clara with a careful consistency that Dorothy had come to understand was its own declaration. He never overstepped and never retreated. He was present without being intrusive. He brought his whole self to the table, literally and figuratively, and left room for the complexity of what they were to each other. Not father and daughter, not quite, but not strangers either. Something newer and more specific, something they were building together in real time. On a warm evening in June, John came to supper with a particular quality of restrained anticipation that Dorothy recognized, and that Clara apparently recognized as well, because she kept looking between them during the meal with the bright, watchful eyes of someone who expects something to happen. After supper, while Clara was clearing the table with a suspicious cheerfulness, John said, "May I speak with you privately?" "Clara," Dorothy said. "I am going," Clara said, already halfway to the kitchen, and the door had barely closed before John turned to Dorothy with something in his expression that she recognized as the absence of all his usual careful management. He had a ring. She had not expected a ring, not yet, and the sight of it, small and simple and bright in the evening light, stopped her breath entirely. "I do not want to wait any longer," he said. "I know you value patience and I know you value carefulness, and I share both of those values, and I also know that I want to spend my life with you, and I see no virtue in delaying the asking." He paused. "Dorothy, will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and then at his face and then at the ring again, and then she did something she had not done with a man in a very long time. She stepped forward and put her arms around him and held on, and he held her back, and she said against the front of his shirt, "Yes, yes, absolutely, without any reservation whatsoever." He exhaled, a long breath she had not realized he was holding, and his arms tightened around her. From the kitchen came a sound that was suspiciously like a 12-syllable word being said very quietly but very emphatically in a tone of profound satisfaction, and Dorothy pulled back and looked at the kitchen door with narrowed eyes. "Clara Ann Bancroft," she said. The kitchen door opened and Clara appeared, already smiling with the wide, unguarded smile she had gotten from Thomas. "I was not listening," she said. "I was just present in the same building." "You were absolutely listening," Dorothy said. "Possibly," Clara admitted. Then she looked at John with the full weight of her 14 years of serious observation. "You are going to be good to her," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," John said. "I am, for as long as I am able," Clara nodded. She crossed the room and with a deliberateness that made Dorothy press her hand over her mouth, held out her hand to John in a formal handshake, which he accepted with equal seriousness. "Welcome to the family," Clara said. They were married in September of 1883. Dorothy wore a dress the color of late summer wheat, because she was the Marshal and she was 33 years old, and she had earned the right to be married in whatever color she pleased, and Clara had helped her make the dress over the course of the summer with Mrs. Alderman's patient guidance. John wore his good suit and a new hat, and looked at Dorothy when she appeared in the church doorway with an expression that she thought she might keep in her memory until the day she died. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Calloway, who had officiated at Thomas Bancroft's funeral 4 years earlier, and who told Dorothy privately before the service that he was genuinely glad to see this day, that Thomas had loved her fiercely and would have wanted her full and happy, and that he thought she had made an excellent choice. The town came. Not all of it, because Brewster did not come and 2 of the saloon owners had a prior engagement with a card game that they had apparently been scheduling for months, but almost all of it. And the hotel dining room where they held the reception afterward was crowded and warm and loud with conversation, and the fiddle player from the previous Christmas came and played for dancing, and Dorothy danced with John for the first time as his wife, and it felt like the first thing and also like coming home. Clara danced with half the town. She had grown taller over the summer, her mother's height now, and she wore a dress of dark rose that suited her beautifully, and she danced with the schoolmaster's son, and with old Mr. Halloway from the dry goods store, and with John once, a formal and dignified dance that Dorothy watched from across the room with her heart so full it was almost painful. After the dancing, when the room was beginning to thin and the candles were burning low, Dorothy found herself sitting beside Mrs. Alderman in a quiet corner, and Mrs. Alderman, who was 70 years old and had seen enough of life to say whatever she thought, took Dorothy's hand and said, "Your first husband was a fine man. This one is a different kind of fine. Both at once is more than most people get." Dorothy looked across the room to where John was in conversation with the new mayor, a young man named Cartwright who had enough energy and idealism to compensate, at least partially, for his inexperience. John was listening more than he was speaking, which was his way, and he had his hand around a cup of coffee and his shoulders were relaxed in a way she had not always seen, and she knew that she was looking at a man who was happy. "I know," she said. "I am aware of how fortunate I am." "Good," Mrs. Alderman said. "Keep being aware of it. Gratitude is the best kind of armor." The following year, the year of 1884, brought changes to Caldwell the way springs always did on the plains, fast and total, and without any particular concern for the people who had made their plans around the old arrangements. The cattle drive slowed. The railroad had shifted some of its routes, and the economic character of the town was adjusting, as such towns did, some businesses closing and new ones opening in the spaces they left. Dorothy tracked these changes with the Marshal's particular awareness of how economic stress rippled outward into behavior, how desperation made people who would otherwise stay honest start making different calculations. There was petty theft in the spring, the kind that came with hungry winter's ending, and people who had gotten through the cold on the edge of having gotten through it all. Dorothy handled it with a combination of firmness and practical mercy that was distinctly her own approach, prosecuting where prosecution was warranted and directing people to what resources existed where it was not. She was also, by April of 1884, aware that she was expecting a child. She told John on a quiet Tuesday evening at home, with the spring dark outside the windows and the smell of rain in the air. She told him the way she told him everything that mattered, directly, clearly, watching his face. What happened to his face was remarkable. It moved through surprise and then through something so large and unguarded that she could not immediately name it, something in the vicinity of joy but deeper than ordinary joy, the joy of a man who had not expected a second chance and had been given one. He stood up from his chair and crossed to her and took both her hands and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am fine," she said. "I am perfectly well. You will tell me if anything changes." "John," she said, amused, "I spent the past 5 years being the marshal of a Kansas cattle town. I am not fragile." "I know you are not fragile," he said. "I am not asking because I think you are fragile. I am asking because you are important to me and I would like to know how you are." She squeezed his hands. "I am happy," she said. "That is primarily how I am. I am happy and I am healthy, and I am going to need you to not become excessively anxious because there is enough anxiety in this family already." "I am not anxious," he said, with an expression that was almost entirely anxiety. She laughed. He pulled her toward him and held her with a careful tenderness that made her close her eyes and lean in, and they stood in the kitchen in the spring evening while the rain began to fall outside, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said. They told Clara 2 weeks later, once they were certain of the timing. Clara went very still in a way Dorothy recognized as her processing expression. Then she said, carefully, "So there will be another person in the house?" "Yes," Dorothy said. "Eventually." "Is that all right?" "It is all right," Clara said. She looked at John. "You have never had children." "No," he said. "This will be new for me." "You are going to have opinions about everything," Clara said. "I have heard that new fathers have opinions about everything." "I expect I will," he said. "You are welcome to correct me when I am wrong." "I will," Clara said, with a certainty that made John press his lips together very firmly. Then Clara said, more quietly, "I am glad for you both." The simplicity of it was, Dorothy knew, the highest thing her daughter could offer, which was the truth without ornamentation. The baby arrived in November of 1884, a boy, and John held him in the Marshal's house, while the doctor finished his work and Dorothy rested. And Dorothy watched her husband's face in the lamplight of the bedroom, and thought that she had never seen him look quite so undone in all the time she had known him. Undone in the best possible way, the way of someone receiving something for which no amount of preparation is adequate. They named him Thomas Henry Underwood. Thomas for the man who had built the foundation of this family, and Henry for John's own middle name, a small act of continuity that felt exactly right to both of them. Clara, who had been a moderately skeptical participant in the pregnancy proceedings, took one look at her baby brother and fell completely and without reservation in love with him, which Dorothy had somewhat predicted, but was moved by nonetheless. Clara was a devoted and practical and occasionally bossy presence in Thomas Henry's early life, which suited him enormously. The years that followed were full in the way that the best years are full, not without difficulty, but with enough love and purpose to give the difficulty meaning. Dorothy remained the Marshal of Caldwell for another 4 years, through 2 more contested elections and one particularly challenging summer, when a drought across the plains brought a wave of desperate men through the territory, and every lawman in Kansas was stretched thin. John was beside her through all of it, as deputy and as husband, managing the balance of their professional and personal lives with the same quiet, competent attention he brought to everything. He was also, as Clara had predicted with some amusement, deeply opinionated about the baby, and then about the toddler, and then about the small boy who appeared to have inherited his mother's determination and his father's quiet observational powers, and from somewhere in the combined ancestry, a laugh so big and sudden it startled everyone in the room every time it appeared. Thomas Henry was 3 years old in the spring of 1887, when Clara came home from school with a letter from a women's college in Illinois that she had applied to without telling anyone except John, who had helped her research the admission requirements and draft her letter of intent. Dorothy read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the kitchen table and looked at her daughter, who was standing with her hands clasped and her chin slightly elevated, which was the posture Clara took when she was prepared for resistance. "You did not tell me you were applying," Dorothy said. "I told Mr. Underwood," Clara said. "John," Dorothy said without looking at him. From across the kitchen, John said, "She asked me to help her research it. I helped her research it." I told her she needed to tell you as soon as she was accepted." "This is the telling," Clara said. Dorothy looked at the letter again. It was a genuine letter of acceptance, warm in its tone, specific about the programs available, the kind of letter she had imagined for Clara in the abstract but had not expected to be holding for several years yet. "This is in Illinois," Dorothy said. "Yes," Clara said. "That is a considerable distance." "Yes," Clara said. "It is also an extraordinary school. It accepts women. It has a program in law and civic administration that is one of the only programs of its kind in the country." Dorothy looked up at her daughter, 17 years old and fierce and brilliant, and so entirely herself that it was sometimes overwhelming to look at her directly. She felt something enormous and bittersweet move through her, the love of a parent watching a child become exactly what they were meant to be. "You would study law," Dorothy said. "I would study everything I could get my hands on," Clara said. "And then I would study law." "Because of me," Dorothy said. "Because of you," Clara confirmed. "Because you showed me that the law could be used as protection for people rather than just as control over them. Because you showed me that someone had to do this work carefully and honestly, and I think I am capable of doing it carefully and honestly." She paused, and something in her expression shifted, became less defended. "Because you kept every promise you could keep and held yourself to account for the ones you could not, and I want to be that kind of person in the world, in whatever way I am able." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. She was aware of John in the kitchen doorway, watching them both, and she was aware of small Thomas Henry playing in the next room with the set of wooden blocks John had carved for him over the winter, and she was aware of the afternoon light on the kitchen table and the acceptance letter under her hand and the whole weight of her life, every part of it, held in this moment. "You are already that kind of person," Dorothy said. "You have been for some time." Clara crossed the kitchen and hugged her mother, which she did not do often enough, in Dorothy's opinion, and Dorothy held her and breathed in the familiar smell of her daughter's hair and felt time moving in both directions at once, toward everything that had built this moment and toward everything that would come after it. "You can go," Dorothy said. "Of course you can go." The summer of 1887 was spent in preparation for Clara's departure, and in all the ordinary, extraordinary business of living that surrounded it. John built additional shelves in Clara's room to accommodate the books she was accumulating for her studies. Dorothy had a new trunk made by the woodworker on 2nd Street, sturdy and well-fitted with brass corners, and she packed it with the careful thoroughness she brought to everything important. On the last evening before Clara was to take the train east, they had supper together, all four of them, with Mrs. Alderman invited because she was family in everything but legal technicality. Thomas Henry sat in his chair and ate his supper with the intense focus of a 3-year-old presented with something he liked, and Clara watched him with a tenderness she did not always show, and John refilled everyone's glasses twice, and Dorothy made the apple cake that had been Thomas Bancroft's favorite, because on important evenings she always made it, a habit of memory that she had never decided to have and could not imagine giving up. After supper, Clara took her baby brother on her lap and read to him until he fell asleep, which he did quickly, because he always fell asleep quickly, and then woke up at an hour that was, John had noted with gentle despair, not considered morning by any reasonable definition. And then Dorothy was alone with her daughter in the kitchen while John settled Thomas Henry for the night, and Clara was quiet in the way she was sometimes quiet, a contained, thoughtful quiet that meant she was building towards something. "Can I tell you something?" Clara said. "Always," Dorothy said. "I was very angry with you," Clara said, "when I was 14, for missing my birthday. And I know we talked about it, and I know you apologized, and I know it has been 3 years and none of this is pressing. But I want to tell you something, now that I am going." "Tell me," Dorothy said. "I understand now," Clara said. "Not just intellectually. I understood that intellectually within a week. But I understand it in the other way, the way that gets into you. You were doing something that mattered for people who needed it, and you came home as fast as you could, and you were honest with me about what had happened and why, and you did not make excuses or try to minimize what I was feeling." She paused. "And then you came back and you did it again, every day. You kept showing up. You kept being present whenever you possibly could. You kept every promise you were able to keep, and when you broke one, you said so and you meant the apology." She paused again. "I did not see that clearly when I was 14. I saw the broken promise. I did not see the 3 years of promises kept around it." Dorothy was very still. "I see it now," Clara said. "All of it, the whole picture." She looked up with Thomas's eyes dark and direct. "You are the most honest person I have ever known, Mama, and the most faithful, and I want to be like that." Dorothy could not speak for a moment. The word faithful struck her particularly because she had not always thought of herself in that word. She thought of herself as responsible, as careful, as committed. But faithful was something larger and simpler and more human, the keeping of the thing in your heart as well as in your actions. "Your father was faithful," Dorothy said finally. "I know," Clara said. "You both were. And then Mr. Underwood, John." She glanced toward the hallway, where the sound of John's voice could be heard very quietly through the bedroom door, saying something to the sleepy Thomas Henry that was too low to make out. "He is faithful as well, in his way, a different way from Papa's, but real." "Yes," Dorothy said, "he is." Clara stood up and hugged her again, and Dorothy held on, and they stayed that way for a long time. The next morning at the train station, the whole town came to say goodbye to Clara. She was known and liked, Thomas Bancroft's daughter, and her departure for college was the kind of event that a small town felt collectively because it was both a pride and a loss. The platform was crowded with people she had known all her life, the teachers and the merchants, and the families who had watched her grow from a girl into this clear-eyed, serious young woman with her mother's stubbornness, and her father's warmth and her own particular combination of both. Thomas Henry was awake and enormously interested in the train, which he pointed at with great urgency, and said something about that none of them could entirely parse, but that conveyed a general enthusiasm. John stood with his hand at Dorothy's back while Clara said her goodbyes to people, working her way down the platform with the organized efficiency that was one of her defining characteristics, and Dorothy watched and felt the tears she was not going to cry where anyone could see them pressing at the back of her eyes. When the conductor called the boarding, Clara came back to them. She kissed Thomas Henry, who grabbed her braid and had to be gently disengaged. She shook John's hand and then, after a moment's hesitation, hugged him with the same quiet definiteness that characterized everything she did. "Take care of her," she said, "and let her take care of you. She is not always good at accepting help." "I know," John said. "I am working on it." Clara looked at Dorothy for a moment in the train station noise and the steam and the morning light. Then she said, "Your mama kept every promise she ever made. I did not always see that before." Dorothy pulled her daughter close and held her and said, "You call when you arrive." "I will," Clara said. "You write every week." "I will." "You come home for Christmas." "I will," Clara said. She pulled back and looked at Dorothy with those dark eyes, steady and certain. "I promise." Dorothy watched her daughter walk down the platform and step onto the train, and she stood there until the train had pulled out of the station and was only a sound, and then not even that, only the smell of coal smoke in the still air. John's hand was at her back the whole time. She turned to him and he looked at her without saying anything, because he understood when nothing needed to be said, and she looked back at him with Thomas Henry sitting on her hip between them, looking toward where the train had been with an expression of absolute wonder. "She is going to be extraordinary," John said. "She already is," Dorothy said. He leaned down and kissed her briefly at the train station, with the whole town around them and the autumn Kansas sky enormous overhead, and she put her free hand against his chest and felt his heartbeat steady and certain beneath her palm. In the months following Clara's departure, the house was quieter in a way that required adjustment. Thomas Henry, for his part, seemed to regard the vacancy as an opportunity and expanded his presence to fill it, becoming louder and more adventurous and increasingly difficult to contain in any single room. Dorothy watched her son with the particular mix of delight and exhaustion that characterized her parenting of him, which was somehow both entirely different from and deeply continuous with how she had raised Clara. John was a natural and devoted father, which did not surprise her but still moved her each time she saw it. The way he watched the boy, the way he got down on the floor to play with him, the patience he brought to the 10,000 repetitions that early childhood required of adults. He had told her once that he had thought he might not have children, that after Alice died he had stopped imagining that future, and that Thomas Henry felt to him like something given back after having been lost, which was a more eloquent and private thing than he usually said, and which she kept in her heart alongside everything else she kept there. She received Clara's first letter 3 weeks after her departure. It was long and detailed and thrumming with the excited energy of someone who had arrived in a place that was exactly what they had hoped it would be. She loved her classes. Her professors were remarkable. She had made 2 friends already, one from Illinois and one from Ohio. The library was the largest she had ever seen, and she had been in it every day. Dorothy read the letter at the kitchen table with Thomas Henry on her lap and then read it again. And then she got up and found John in the back of the house where he was fixing a hinge that had been troubling them for a week, and she read him the best parts out loud. He listened with his full attention, the way he always listened, and when she finished he said, "She is going to be fine." "She is going to be more than fine," Dorothy said. "Yes," he agreed. "She is going to be extraordinary." In the spring of 1888, Dorothy decided not to stand for re-election as Marshal. It was not a decision made from defeat or discouragement, but from the clear-eyed assessment of where she was and what she wanted. She had done the work for 9 years. She had done it well. Caldwell was a different town than it had been when she had stepped into the role, more stable, more equitable in the particular specific ways that a marshal's conduct over time could influence such things. She had given it her best, and it had given her, among other things, 18 months of working alongside John Underwood, which had given her everything else. She told the council in February. She told them her reasons, which were professional and personal and completely honest, because she had never conducted herself any other way in this office. They accepted her resignation with the kind of genuine respect that she had not always received from them, and that she received with genuine gratitude. John was appointed in her place, which was not a decision she had any official part in but which was, she thought, precisely correct. He had the experience and the temperament and the knowledge of the town, and he brought to the role the same qualities he brought to everything: steadiness, fairness, and a watchful, unassuming competence that turned out to be the most effective kind. She helped him transition into the role with the same thoroughness she had given everything over 9 years, and then she stepped back and let it be his, and found that the stepping back felt, to her considerable surprise, like relief rather than loss. She had things to do. She had Thomas Henry, who was 4½ and in possession of approximately the energy of 6 average children. She had Clara's letters to write and read. She had, she discovered, a genuine interest in the administrative and documentary work that a town in transition required: record-keeping, correspondence, the management of legal and civic paperwork that had accumulated over years of rapid growth. She began helping the new interim mayor, Cartwright, who was perpetually overwhelmed and was also, she had determined, basically a decent young man who would be fine if he could just find adequate administrative support. She was, in other words, busy and purposeful, which was the only kind of life she had ever quite known how to live. In the autumn of 1888, Clara came home for a visit, not Christmas, because she had been invited to spend Christmas with a classmate's family in Chicago for an experience she did not want to miss, but October, when the plains went golden and the air had its particular fine clarity. She had been gone for 14 months. She came back on the same train she had left on, and Dorothy was at the station with John and Thomas Henry. And when Clara stepped off the platform and Dorothy saw her, she understood something about time and growth that she had known intellectually, but had not felt until this moment. Her daughter had grown in ways that had nothing to do with height. She had the particular quality of a person who has been genuinely educated, not merely instructed but expanded, who has been given language and framework for things she already knew in her bones, and has returned able to speak them plainly. She was also, Dorothy noticed, happy in a way she had not always been, a settled, specific happiness, the happiness of someone who has found the place where her abilities and her passions and the world's needs coincide. They had supper at the house, just the four of them, because Mrs. Alderman was visiting a sister in the next county, and the table was noisy and full. Clara and Thomas Henry discovering each other at their new sizes. Thomas Henry intensely suspicious of this large person who kept calling him her baby brother, and then proving herself entirely acceptable by showing him a card trick she had learned. After Thomas Henry had been put to bed with difficulty and considerable negotiation, Dorothy and Clara and John sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and Clara told them about her year. She told them everything, the courses and the professors and the arguments she had won in seminar, and the arguments she had lost, and what she had learned from losing them. She told them about her friends and the city and the experiences that had no equivalent in Caldwell, and that she was still in the process of understanding. She was articulate and specific and occasionally very funny, and Dorothy watched her and felt the love and the pride so thoroughly mixed together she could not have separated them. Late in the evening, after a lull in the conversation, Clara looked at John across the table. "When I was getting on the train," she said, "I told Mama that she had kept every promise she ever made and that I had not always seen it before." She glanced at Dorothy and then back at John. "Did she tell you I said that?" "She did," John said. "What did you think?" Clara asked. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quality of quiet he brought to things he was thinking through carefully. "I thought you were right," he said, "and I thought I had seen it for some time, what I had not put into those exact words before you said them." He paused. "Your mother has a quality that I think is rarer than it should be. She does what she says she will do. She does not perform integrity, she simply has it, as a characteristic of her character." He glanced at Dorothy with that look she had come to know so well, the one that was direct and warm and completely unself-conscious. "I recognized it when I had known her about 3 weeks. It was one of the first things I understood about her." "Is that when you started to love her?" Clara asked, with the frank curiosity of someone who has been studying law and has learned that direct questions produce better evidence than indirect ones. "No," he said. "I recognized it in 3 weeks. Loving her took a bit longer. You cannot love someone you do not know, and knowing her required time." He paused. "But it was why I wanted to know her. It was why I paid attention." Dorothy looked at her husband across the kitchen table, and he looked at her, and Clara sat between them watching with the warm, satisfied expression of someone witnessing a confirmation of something they had long believed to be true. In the winter of 1889, Dorothy found that she was expecting again. She told John on a January evening with the snow falling outside and Thomas Henry asleep and the fire going in the kitchen, and his response this time was quicker to find and fuller, because he was a different man in this moment than he had been the first time, more himself in the context of this life, more practiced at receiving joy without being overwhelmed by it. He held her and said nothing for a long moment, and then he said, "A boy or a girl?" "We will find out in August," she said. "Good," he said. "Thomas Henry is going to be deeply unimpressed," she said. "He will come around," John said. He came around on Clara. This was true. Thomas Henry's relationship with Clara, which had been conducted primarily through letters she had begun writing him in careful block letters that he treasured enormously without being able to read them, had evolved into a devoted long-distance attachment that expressed itself in his keeping all her letters in a small box under his bed, and in his informing anyone who did not already know that his sister was at college and was learning about the law. The baby arrived in August of 1889, a girl this time, small and loud and immediately definite about her opinions. They named her Alice Ruth Underwood, Alice for the first woman John had loved, which Dorothy had suggested without prompting and which had made John unable to speak for a full minute, and Ruth for Dorothy's own mother, who had died when Dorothy was young but whose fierce and quiet practicality she had inherited in ways she recognized more clearly the older she got. Clara came home for Christmas that year and held her new sister with the careful and absorbed attention of someone who is memorizing something important. And the house was full in a way that Dorothy had not felt since before Thomas Bancroft died, the specific fullness of a house with children in it at different stages, with a family at different sizes altogether. On Christmas Day, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, John and Dorothy sat by the fire in the main room. The stockings still hung from the mantel, and the small cedar tree decorated with the things they had accumulated over years of Christmases. Small ornaments and pieces of ribbon, and a carved wooden star that had been Thomas Henry's contribution to the tradition. And the fire crackled, and the winter dark was full outside, and they were the only two people awake in the world. Which was how every marriage felt on its best evenings. "Are you happy?" John asked. She considered the question with the seriousness she gave to things that deserved seriousness. "I am the happiest I have been," she said, "in a way that accounts for all of it, the grief and the difficulty and the work. I'm not happy despite those things. I'm happy with them because they are part of what has made everything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think about Alice sometimes, about how different it would all have been. And I think the grief of losing her was real and complete, and I would not wish it away because it is part of who I am and who I am led me here." He paused. "I am grateful for my whole life, including the parts that were hard. Thomas would have liked you," Dorothy said. "You would have driven each other slightly mad because you are both so quiet and deliberate and you both thought deeply about fairness and the law, but he would have liked you." "I think I would have liked him," John said. "You two would have liked each other," she said, and then argued about something procedural for 3 hours. He smiled, the real one, and she reached across the space between them and took his hand. They sat that way while the fire burned down, and the house around them held its sleeping children and its accumulated years, and the particular warmth of a place where love has been practiced consistently enough to become structural, as fundamental as the walls and the roof, holding everything else up. The years unrolled with the steady purposefulness of a life being fully lived. Clara finished her studies in 1891 and returned to Kansas, not to Caldwell immediately, but to the county seat, where she took a position as a legal clerk with a firm that was beginning to build a practice in civil law. She was the only woman in the office and handled the fact with the calm, unsurprised persistence that her mother had modeled for her, doing her work thoroughly and excellently, and waiting with patience for the world to catch up with what she already knew she was capable of. She came home regularly, Sunday dinners when she could make the distance, and on those evenings the house on Main Street was loud and full, and exactly what Dorothy had once, in the darkest year after Thomas died, believed she would never again have. Thomas Henry started school in 1890 and revealed himself to be an extraordinary reader and a barely adequate mathematician, which Dorothy found deeply familiar, and John spent 3 evenings a week at the kitchen table working through arithmetic with his son, in a collaboration that managed to be both productive and enormously entertaining. Alice Ruth was walking by 14 months and talking by 18 and expressing fully formed opinions about the allocation of resources in the household by the age of 2, which Dorothy told John she felt was entirely characteristic of both of their families, and he agreed with the equanimity of a man who had long since made his peace with living surrounded by strong-willed women. John served as Marshal of Caldwell for 6 years, until 1894, when he was offered the position of county sheriff, following the retirement of the man who had originally recommended him to Dorothy back in 1881. He took the position after a conversation with Dorothy that lasted 3 evenings and covered everything relevant, the logistics and the implications, and the ways it would change their daily life, and the ways it would not. They decided together, which was how they made decisions, and he accepted the appointment, and Dorothy found that watching her husband be trusted with a larger responsibility gave her a satisfaction that was distinct from and complementary to her satisfaction with her own work. She had, by this point, built something that she had not originally planned to build, a reputation in the civic life of Caldwell that went beyond her Marshal years. She served on the school board. She helped establish a lending library with a rotating collection of books that came from a subscription service in Wichita. She was involved, quietly and persistently, in the kind of work that changed towns from the inside rather than the outside, the incremental, unspectacular work of building institutions that lasted. It was work that suited her. It was work that used everything she had, the patience and the method and the commitment to fairness that had always been her defining qualities, and it was work that her children watched her do, which she thought about sometimes, the way children learn not from what you tell them but from what you show them. Clara was admitted to the bar in 1895, one of the first women to be admitted in Kansas. Dorothy received the letter on a Thursday and read it standing at the kitchen table, and then sat down because her legs were not quite supporting her in the ordinary way. John came in from outside and found her sitting there with the letter in her hand and a particular expression on her face, and he sat down across from her without asking any questions and waited. "She did it," Dorothy said. He read the letter, he set it down. He covered Dorothy's hands with his, and they sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon light of a Thursday in 1895, and they were both, in their different and complementary ways, more proud than they had ever been of anything. Clara came home the following weekend. She arrived on the Friday evening train, and they were all at the station. Thomas Henry, now 11 years old, and Alice Ruth 6, and both of them understanding in their different ways that something significant was happening, though only Thomas Henry had quite grasped the specifics. At supper, when the toast had been made and the apple cake cut and Thomas Henry had asked approximately 40 questions about what it meant to be an attorney and Alice Ruth had fallen asleep in her chair, Clara said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell us," Dorothy said. "When I was 14, Clara said, "and you missed my birthday, I called you a liar." She looked at Dorothy steadily. "I have thought about that a great deal over the years. I thought about it especially when I was in law school and learning about intent and action and the gap between what people promise and what they do." She paused. "You were never a liar. You were a person in an impossible situation who made the best possible choice and held herself accountable for what it cost. That is not lying. That is the opposite of lying." Dorothy said nothing. She held Clara's eyes. "I want to say it plainly," Clara said, "not as a correction to something old, as a true thing that I believe and that I want you to hear. Your mama kept every promise she ever made. That is what I would tell anyone who asked. That is the truest thing I know about you." The kitchen was very quiet. John had his hand on the table near Dorothy's, not quite touching, just present. "I heard you on the platform," Dorothy said, "when you left for school." Those were the same words. "I know," Clara said. "I have been thinking them for 8 years. They are still true." Dorothy reached across the table and covered her daughter's hand. "You turned out to be the person I always hoped you would be," she said. "That is not nothing. That is everything." Alice Ruth shifted in her chair and did not quite wake up, and Thomas Henry was still and quiet for once in his enormously energetic life. And John looked at Dorothy with everything she had ever needed to see in another person's eyes, and the kitchen held them all, warm and particular and theirs. The new century arrived, and the West changed as it had always changed, rapidly and without sentimentality. The open cattle range giving way to fenced land, and the coming of the automobile in distant cities, and the sense that the vast, ungoverned country of Dorothy's younger years was becoming something more ordered and more constrained. She felt this sometimes with a faint nostalgia that she recognized as irrational, because the ungoverned country had cost a great deal, had cost people like Thomas Bancroft their lives, and anything that made such costs less common was, on balance, worth having. John retired from the sheriff's position in 1902. He was 54 years old and entirely healthy, and his reason for retiring was simple, and the same reason Dorothy had given for her own retirement. He had done what he could do in this role, and there were other things waiting. They were still living in Caldwell. The house on Main Street had been added to twice, a room when Alice Ruth was born and another room when Thomas Henry was 14, and had developed opinions about the inadequacy of shared space. It was a solid, comfortable house that had been the site of everything important in their lives, and Dorothy did not want to leave it. Thomas Henry was 18 in 1902 and had grown into a thoughtful, steady young man with John's observational patience and Dorothy's direct manner. He was reading law, influenced by Clara, and intended to study formally when the time was right. He was also, Dorothy had noted with a private and maternal satisfaction, being courted by a young woman named Hester who worked at the lending library, and who had the kind of quiet, clear-eyed intelligence that Dorothy recognized as exactly the right complement to her son's personality. Alice Ruth was 13, and showed every indication of being the family member who would eventually exceed all of them, a prediction that Clara made openly, and that Alice Ruth received with the complete composure of someone who has always been aware of her own capacities, without being particularly troubled by them. Clara was practicing law in the county seat, and had been there for 7 years, and had built a reputation that extended well beyond Caldwell, a reputation for thoroughness and fairness, and an unwillingness to be intimidated by any aspect of any situation, which she had gotten from both of her parents in equal measure, and which served her profession beautifully. She had also, in 1901, married a man named Elliot Sherwood, who was a surveyor from Nebraska and whose defining qualities, as far as Dorothy could determine, were a deep steadiness, a genuine respect for Clara that was not performative, and a willingness to follow Clara's lead in any room without any apparent loss of his own confidence. Dorothy had approved of him from the beginning and had told Clara so, and Clara had said, "I know you approve of him, Mama. I could see it the first Sunday you met him." "How?" Dorothy asked. "You stopped watching him so carefully," Clara said. "You watch people you have not decided about. When you decided, you relaxed." Dorothy had thought about this and concluded that it was accurate. Elliot and Clara had a son in 1903, a boy they named James Thomas Sherwood, and Dorothy became a grandmother at the age of 53 with the same mixture of joy and bewilderment that had characterized every major transition in her life. The sense that time was moving at both its ordinary pace and a pace too fast to track. She and John drove out to see them in the summer of 1903, in the way that had become their summer habit, taking the train to the county seat and spending a week with Clara and Elliot and the baby. James Thomas was approximately 3 weeks old and the size and texture of something that should not yet be trusted in the world and was, Dorothy told John privately, the most perfect thing she had seen since Alice Ruth. John held the baby with the practiced ease of a man who had held 2 children of his own, and the humility of someone confronting a generation that is not his to shape, only to support. He held him and looked at him in the summer light of Clara's parlor and said nothing for a long time. "You are thinking something," Clara said. She was watching him from the armchair where she sat with the specific alertness of a new mother. "I am thinking," John said, "that things persist in ways that are not always visible in the moment." He looked up at her. "Your father built something in you, and you built something in this child, and the things that were built in you partly came from him and partly came from your mother and partly came from yourself." He paused. I think about legacy sometimes. What persists? What do you think persists? Clara asked. He considered it. Character, he said. The specific quality of how people keep their word and treat each other. That persists. In exactly this way. He looked down at James Thomas, who had closed his eyes with the total commitment of the very young. This child is going to grow up knowing that his grandmother was the Marshal of Caldwell, Kansas, and that she did the work the way she did it, and that will be in him even when he cannot trace where it came from. Dorothy, sitting beside John on the settee, felt the truth of this land in her with a weight that was almost entirely warmth. Your mama kept every promise she ever made, Clara said. She said it quietly, looking at Dorothy with the direct and total honesty that was her birthright and her practice. I did not always see that. I see it now. I saw it when I was 17, and I see it now more completely. She paused. I tell James Thomas about you, already. Even at 3 weeks, I tell him I wanted to start early. He cannot understand a word, Dorothy said. He understands the sound, Clara said. The quality of how things are said. He knows when I am saying something important. She looked down at her son. I tell him that his grandmother is a woman who means what she says. That is the foundation. The rest can come later. John pressed his shoulder gently against Dorothy's, and she leaned into him in the summer parlor while the afternoon light moved across the floor. And she felt her life, the whole arc of it, the grief and the duty and the love and the work and the keeping of promises and the cost of keeping them, settle into something that could only be called gratitude. In the September of 1903, back in Caldwell, on an evening so clear the stars looked like something that had been placed there with intention, Dorothy and John sat on the front porch of the house on Main Street, the way they had come to sit most evenings, close together, in the chairs that had occupied this porch for 15 years and showed it. The town around them was quiet and familiar. The sound of the Main Street reached them, muted and comfortable, the ordinary noises of a town in autumn evening. A dog somewhere on a side street, the far sound of the hotel, a train in the distance going somewhere. I have been thinking, Dorothy said. Tell me, he said. She had been thinking about the shape of her life, not with regret but with the particular, clear-eyed assessment she brought to things she cared about. She had been thinking about all the things she had promised over the years, to this town and to her children and to John and to herself, and about the ones she had kept and the ones she had broken and what all of it added up to. I think I have been the person I intended to be, she said. Not perfectly. I have not been perfect. But I have been faithful to the important things. I have kept the promises that mattered. I have told the truth when the truth was hard. She paused. I think I have done the work I was given to do. John was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said, you have, and then some. She looked at him. In the evening light his face was known to her in every detail, every line and the silver of his hair and the brown of his eyes. 20 years of knowing each other and all of it presents simultaneously in the way you carry the people you love. Are you happy? She asked him. She asked it the way he had asked her once by the fire in another winter, directly and expecting the truth. He took her hand. I am so happy, he said, that I sometimes feel I have to be careful with it, like something that could break. He paused. And then I remember that it is not fragile, that it is built on real things. And I stop being careful and just feel it. She turned his hand over and looked at it in the evening light, the hand that had held Thomas Henry when he was 3 weeks old and Alice Ruth before that and Clara, once, on her last night before she left for college, just briefly, in a handshake that was something more. The hand that had covered hers on a desk in the Marshal's office on a September evening when she was alone with her grief and her work. The hand that had held hers formally and publicly on the steps of a church in September of 1883. I kept the most important promise, she said. When I married you, I promised to be faithful to this life we were building. I have been. You have, he said. So have I know, she said. That is the thing about you, I always knew. The stars moved in their slow, enormous arcs overhead, and the town breathed around them in the September dark. and the house behind them held the sleeping life they had built together. And Dorothy Bancroft Underwood sat on her porch with the man she loved, in the town where she had built everything that mattered, and felt, as she had felt increasingly often in recent years, that this was precisely and completely what life was for. Not the moments of drama or danger, not the arrests or the votes or the letters of achievement, though all of those had their place. Not the perfect birthdays she had managed or the imperfect ones she had not. But this, the ordinary evening, the kept promises accumulated into a life, the love that had been practiced carefully and consistently until it was not careful at all, only second nature, only the most basic and essential thing about both of them. Thomas Henry came home late from the library or from Hester's, which were increasingly interchangeable destinations. He came up the porch steps and said goodnight with the easy affection of a young man who has always been secure in his family, and they said goodnight, and he went inside. And then it was just them again, in the September dark, with the whole of their lives behind them and whatever came next ahead, and Dorothy leaned her head on John's shoulder and felt his hand tighten on hers, and the stars kept their watch above the plains, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas, continued in its ordinary and extraordinary way, holding within it, as every small town holds within it if you know where to look, the full and complicated weight of human lives honestly lived. She had kept her promises. She had loved fully and been loved in return. She had raised her children to know the value of their word. And in the quiet evidence of this evening, in the warmth of the hand that held hers and the sleeping house behind her and the stars above the Kansas plain, she knew that this was everything. Not almost everything, not most of what she had wanted, everything.